Joining the Human Progress podcast today is the inimitable Isaac Arthur. Isaac is an award-winning science educator, futurist, and YouTube star. His YouTube channel, Science and Futurism with Isaac Arthur, or SFIA, focuses on a wide variety of topics dealing with science, technology, space exploration, engineering, artificial intelligence, and transhumanism, among other subjects. And he joins the podcast today to discuss a really engrossing and insightful video of his titled Challenges and Predictions for the Next 100 Years, where he shares his top 10 predictions for life a century from now. Isaac, how are you?
Doing great. Thanks for having me on, Chelsea.
Right. And you note at the beginning of your video that your show is often noted for its general optimism, but you point out that isn't actually your intention. And perhaps your channel only feels optimistic because so much discourse about the future these days is just so dark and apocalyptic, even, that anything short of believing in humanity's inevitable near-term destruction seems, relatively speaking, downright cheerful.
Sure.
So why do you think the outlook of the future and even the tone of a lot of science fiction recently has become so overwhelmingly dystopian and apocalyptic, even pre-pandemic? And why do you think seeing annihilation as inevitable is not actually the most sensible way to think about the future?
My favorite movie, Blade Runner, came out in the early 1980s and was very much showed an LA that was a smog-covered heck hole full of industry, which kind of nailed on the head. But in the year 2019, so I'm actually going out to LA in a couple of weeks here, so they're going to mob me now. But there's another one that just came out this year in 2022, Soylent Green, the classic one about valuing people, and so that came out mid 1970s, both set in the year 2022, and say, well, the world doesn't seem that apocalyptic compared to what they had then. And you have a lot of films, even before that, Metropolis, kind of the classic for sci-fi film, very dystopian, very dystopian. And on the one hand, you have to, say, yes, you're writing science fiction, so of course it has to have a certain amount of tension in it because paradise is really boring from a literary standpoint. Usually shows up in the prologue of a book series right before there's a big fall. And on the other hand, there is definitely a tendency of that to infect people a lot. And part of that's the 24-hour news cycle. Always bad news, because bad news has a lot of longevity. Good news can wait. But at the same time, there are definitely bits of flavor to science fiction that seem a lot more dystopian than even when I was a kid. And that's when like the cyberpunk genre, which is very dystopian emerged. I think people just tend to get stuck in a mode that says there are no good solutions to these problems. They can't be solved. Or even, and this is the one that I tend to be more concerned about, the tendency to look at their fellow humans and say, these people are idiots, and thus we're screwed. And I said, that's one that's unfair to your fellow humans. Most of them don't care about an individual issue as much as you because they have other issues they're working on. But, that if you start from the standpoint that everybody around you is selfish or incompetent, then of course the world is going to end. And I said, well, what's wrong with that belief? I said, well, they were equally selfish and incompetent 100 years ago, 200 years ago, and every other time since then that people have been predicting the end of the world. So that is part of what keeps me optimistic. Another part is just to look at history. We've been on a constant upward path for a lot more than a couple of centuries. The technological progress thing that's been a constant snowball, that's very recent, to be fair. But even going back a couple thousand years, we've seen a very steady progress towards better livelihoods for people, more people. And it just tends to work against the whole Malthusian notion of always running out of resources and then turning cannibal on each other. And I'm not saying that we don't have things to be worried about and we'd be fools not to, but I generally tend to think so long as you got good spirits and challenge, you're good. But if you don't, the types of humanity that are always shown with these dystopian apocalypses tend to be sort of people who I really wouldn't want our civilization to be survived by anyway. So if I won't be around for that, and there are no good examples of human, I'm not really all that worried about what happens to them anyway. So that being the case, it helps me stay more optimistic.
And of course, it's not just science fiction that can be pessimistic. You also point out toward the start of the video that a lot of predictions about the future, including negative predictions, are often wrong. And you say this very memorable line that it can almost seem like as soon as someone makes a prediction, it's actually less likely to happen, like the opposite of a self-fulfilling prophecy. An obvious example might be the Y2K technological crisis that was supposed to bring about a kind of digital apocalypse in the year 2000. Obviously, that never happened. The example you bring up in the video is the hole in the ozone layer, which is supposed to keep expanding and turn the planet into a desert. So this tendency to create doomsday prophecies is something that has been around for a while. But how confident are you in your predictions for the
None,
next
not at
century?
all. No. I used to joke if I had a business card, I would put on it SEER. I'm right 51% of the time, which, to be honest, in the prediction game would actually be really good. Um, it's more like a multiple choice sheet. The thing is, and we do need to have in mind, we talk about things like the ozone layer, like Y2K, those were real problems. Did we exaggerate them? Or did we actually buckle down and mostly fix them? Did innovation and effort get them done? And the answer might be probably, depending on the crisis, some combination of all the above. The problems sometimes get exaggerated. Sometimes they have way more effort thrown at them than we tend to realize. Sometimes we just lucked out and innovated our way out of it. And I don't really like to think of it entirely as a luck thing, but discovery from a civilization standpoint can't really be quantified into this is definitely going to happen. Someone could come out tomorrow with an easy way to convert, sunlight into nicely stored, very efficient battery cells you could plug into your car, and now it just becomes dirt cheap to start building electric cars that can go, 5,000 miles when you need to refuel off of a sheet you'd unfold over top of the car. That's inside the realm of physically possible. I wouldn't invest in that at the moment, but it's possible. And we might get there someday. And if it happens tomorrow, because sometimes inventions do happen that way, then the entire economy changes and the whole problem of, for instance, global warming gone, right? Just like that. Does that mean it was never a problem in the first place? No. Does that mean that the problem was never been exaggerated or underestimated? No. There's been a many cases of these crises where we worry about the wrong things, or we don't worry about enough, or we go way overboard too. Unemployment with robots. We always worry about the factory jobs, booting the robots. The robots will kick everyone to the corner and everybody who's blue collar will be out of the workforce entirely. But it's wrong. It's not the blue collar jobs that get eliminated first. It's the white collar jobs. The first people who were eliminated from that job were computers. That was a job title. That was a job title for a long time. And they were gone like that overnight, And so we can certainly be worried about computers in the workforce as a problem, and they will be, as well as a great boon. But we often forget which ones they're going to actually be hitting. And that's the kind of crisis that hit us anyway. Because again, it's not like we magically get through every crisis that ever comes up in front of us. It's more that I don't want to say about the skin of our teeth. We constantly encounter problems we didn't even think we were going to come across that are epically bad, and we survive. And we come across other ones where we see them ways out, and because we did, we fix them. Or other ones where we say, "Oh, well, we can see this problem; it's not a problem." So we get through because they are billions of us working very hard to survive. So.
Right, and you certainly do not minimize the challenges that lie ahead for humanity. You actually spend more of the video talking about the challenges than about your more optimistic predictions. But I was heartened by just how optimistic many of your predictions are. And because this is the Human Progress podcast, I do want to focus more on the positive predictions because they are such a breath of fresh air. But before I ask you about any of the individual predictions, I'm curious, what are you the most optimistic about in regards to the next century?
Well, people always ask me what technology I hope to live to see invented, and I always say life extension technology because it's just so much easier to see other stuff get invented. I would say that probably the improvements in medical technology would be the ones I'm most optimistic about, or at least most hopeful for. It's going to be a long, slow slog. Aubrey de Grey is a person I know and worked with. He's a great guy. I don't think he's super optimistic about life extension, but even he says, don't go betting on living to be centuries old anytime soon. But at the same time, he's done such a great job with the SENS Research Center on actually convincing people that aging is not some inevitable wear down thing that cannot be fixed. And that all these individual medical technologies, each innovation we make in medicine is life extension technology. And so I would say the better, healthier quality of life, to be able to actually say people being born today might never, ever, ever get a gray hair, except for the fact that they thought it was cool to have one, or they dyed it that color like they do blue or purple nowadays, that people could live to be centuries old and still enjoy all the vigor, all the health, all the energy you have in your 20s or 30s, and all the judgment and wisdom you get much earlier on in life that you wish you had then. Youth is wasted on the young is a comment. I think that will probably be a lot more, lot more of what the future is about for us is just how do I live this longer, healthier life? And that's not just a good technology in the sense that, oh, I get to live longer. It's the idea that most kids are going to have not just their grandparents to rely on, not their parents, but their great, great, great grandparents potentially kicking around available to help raise them, to help be good influence on them from childhood on. The idea that you only need to devote maybe 2 or 3% of your economy to raising kids or taking care of seniors because almost everybody is in the bulk of their main productive life. What does that do for your available taxes and funds? And what does that do for people's long-term investments? Are they now much more willing to make decisions and purchases that are long range and good, as opposed to often very short-term ones? What does a civilization look like in terms of what it votes for, what it wants, what it aims for commercially, when the average age is 120? It's
Right.
a very different civilization. So to me, that's the technology that changes things even more than artificial intelligence does. And that's the other big one.
That is a great lead in to discussing one of your predictions, which is that at some point over the next century, the average life expectancy will exceed 100 years. And when you look at the life expectancy in the countries with the highest life expectancy today, Japan and so forth, it's not that far off from that. But why do you believe that we can achieve a life expectancy of over 100 years at some point in the next century?
I mean, partially, I appeal to people on this based on the basic core science, as well as on the, what they see with their own eyes. You look at photographs of people from a century ago and you say, wow, look at those folks with their grandkids. You say, that's not their grandkids. That's their parents. And they're only like 50 and they look ancient, and then you look around. When I was a kid, George Burns, famous comedian, turned 100. It was a big deal because that didn't happen much. I looked up recently for a different question. Somebody asked me, how often people actually live to be 115? And it was in terms of someone's grandfather still being around, and that's how old they would be. And we looked it up, and there's about 100 people right now who are 115. Right? And it almost doubles when you go down to 113. And of that 115, actually they're all women, but you start getting a lot of guys above 110. And you start looking at over 100. It was a big deal in a town if somebody actually lived to be 100. Now it's someone celebrating that almost every year in a decent sized town. And it's not that tons of people are living over 100. It's the fact that most people will now know someone who lived over 100. And those were the people who were born, before the Great Depression started. Right? I mean, well, it just hit right now, right? That was a pretty big deal, right? These are people who lived through that whole thing, all that hardship. So this is not, people who are living under vast improved medical technology their whole life. And that is the anecdotal evidence. That's the look around you and see all the little bits of evidence that people are just living longer. Look around and see that even in the third world, life expectancies have risen enormously in the last 50 years, even as the population has risen. Counterintuitively from a certain perspective, but we have to say the more people there are, the more productive the civilization is per individual too. And then we say, look at the technology. You can repair anything if you want to put the effort into it, right? That nice old house that takes a lot of effort to keep maintained. So we say, why don't we tear that down and replace it? It's not a person, right? You can always rebuild a house. We want to dump a little bit more into it than you probably should. Well, people are not houses. We're going to dump a lot of effort into them. If we can find ways to repair people, we will. And we have all this nanotechnology. And people say, well, can you really have tiny little robots? And say, well, yeah. Life in theory started on Earth as very tiny little organisms about the size of viruses or a bit bigger, and it grew in complexity. We started big because we're doing machines with hands and materials available. We can make them smaller. We're making them smaller. We can make them so they self-replicate. People will think that the idea of a machine that can make a copy of itself is complex. It is not. A self-clanking replicator, as you call it, which would be something like a factory complex. And again, it doesn't have to be a tiny little robot. It could be a factory complex that basically sent out robots that went and dug up material for it and built all the stuff it needed to be huge. We call that a clanking self-replicator. We don't do that because specialization is so valuable. A diverse ecosystem is so valuable, whether we're talking about in nature or we're talking about in the economic landscape. You don't really want or need a Walmart that can build more Walmarts of itself. Is it a self-replicating system? Well, clearly, Walmarts will building more of themselves. They just want, undergoing mitosis on the spot and it will fly away as a seed. But we already have self-replicating machines, so we don't make the tiny ones. We're getting there. We will have these things sooner than later. Will it happen in 20 years? Sooner than later, though. And once it does, it changes so many things, because then you don't have to export tons of material up to space. You can build things on site on these things like the moon or the asteroids. Once you have that technology in place, you can just improve so many tiny little things. It's going to have some huge impacts on things like the retail market when you could potentially print something at home, though we're not really looking at something like the Star Trek replicator. That doesn't really work on unknown physics anyway, but it is that change in the options available that's such a huge shift that it is very much like the Henry Ford concept about asking people what they want, and they say faster horses, not a car. Right? These are going to be technologies you can't predict the other side of, what we call a technological singularity. We're not just talking about Skynet, because it's so hard to predict what would be happening afterwards. But we can say, as long as humans are in the game, they have certain basic motivations they're going to want to follow. And one of those motivations is that they are going to want to have a longer, healthier, happier life. And people say, well, is that really a motivation? So look at the day-to-day anecdotal obvious bits from your eyes. People would like to live longer. Right now, we don't really invest too much into life extension technology. We're just getting around to it. The big one was Pete or Theo. He donated a ton of money to it. But partially that's because we don't believe that technology can exist. We've been raised that way. And there's a little bit, we talk about this, some of us who are more into the life extension thing, we encounter from folks a disbelief, right? And say, well, where is that coming from? And a lot of times it's kind of rooting the idea that you've lost a lot of family members growing up. You've seen people you love die of old age. We all have, and you kind of want their life to have been a natural thing, for it to have come to, they were making way for the next generation. They had a good, long, happy life, and it was supposed to end. And of course, life extension is about immortality. It's about extension. You ain't going to be immortal. Nothing lasts forever. But we need to kind of move that away. And it doesn't take much. You have to make that first key bit of evidence that for most people says this is going to happen. And then it will snowball. A little bit like what's happening with SpaceX now for going into space. Everyone went through the 80s and 90s and early thousands was just devastated by we went to the moon, and now what? Hubble. A space station that appears to be not much better than Mir or the shuttles. No shuttles. But then you have, SpaceX come by and kind of ignite the belief that these things can snowball. You'll see something similar with life extension technology, much as you saw with computers, right? They went from being an interesting artifact of the early 80s that few households had to, with Windows 95 and things like Nintendo, something that every household had, and that took a decade. So when it snowballs, and then that's we have that double in every year thing, the Moore's Law thing. When it generally snowballs, it rolls out fast because we throw all of our energy at it. And so I think once you convince people that life extension technology is something that's on the horizon, that's exactly what will happen. So I am very optimistic about that for this century.
And any medical improvements, as you say, are a form of life extension technology in the sense that they're making us live longer. You touched on a number of your other predictions in that answer. And one of the ones that you touched upon would be nanotechnology. One of your predictions is that in the future, it will be very common to have a sort of small robots or nanobots, nanotechnology in your body for medical purposes, perhaps for other purposes. Could you expand a bit upon that prediction about nanotechnology?
And I should say, usually when folks from SENS, for instance, are talking about life extension, they're not talking about using nanomachines. That's the fallback as I see it. Those are things we know we can absolutely build under known physical laws and can potentially get there sooner than later. They're usually looking at much more simplistic methods that rely on much more modern tech, clearing waste out, things like that. But to me, the ultimate for this is always to go ahead and replace the natural kind of more accidental or non-specialized things with stuff we've chosen to make. With nanotechnology, with tiny machines that are really no different than a virus, right? Or a human cell, tiny machines, you have the ability to start actually tailoring to what your needs are, your specific needs on the person or the occasion. So a common misconception people tend to have when they're looking at that scale is say, well, there's atoms and molecules, and then you got cells, and then you got people. And say, well, how many atoms do you think are in the typical cell? I'll ask folks, and they'll say, well, probably a lot. They say hundreds, thousands, millions, probably thousands. They say it's more like a trillion. It could be many, many millions to billions for even the smallest cell. There's a ton of atoms in these things. When you think of an atom and you think of a cell, think of a brick that you use to build a house, and then don't think of a house, think of a city like New York. That cell is New York, that brick is an atom. There's a hugely complicated machinery infrastructure inside every cell. And yet, even with all that, they still vary in type a lot. The key of nanotechnology isn't the idea of some universal tiny little robot that does the same job when it's ordered to. It's about an entire ecosystem of them ranging from the tiniest little things that go poke something, and that's all they know how to do is follow a location to a single spot and go poke, to ones that are complex construction devices of such objects or others. And so it's not the idea that a trillion little robots will be inside you, though that would be accurate, same as you have trillions of cells inside you. It's the idea that you have almost an entire different organ system, much you have like a respiratory system or cardiovascular system or a skeletal system, not a biologist. You would also have your machine system, if you will. I think probably you'd want to find a better term for that people are a little bit more comfortable with, but that other thing, your second skeleton, if it will. And that's going to have a whole ton of different functions, not just repairing you, but probably also doing little things like taking constant beats of your health as you launch your data, keeping track of your location so you know where you were, keeping photographs for you, all sorts of things like that. It's a digital system. And people say that I don't know if people will be comfortable with a trillion little robots in here though. And say, well, you want what, a trillion of your own cells? And well, those are my cells. Say, well, most of the cells in your body don't even have your DNA in them, right? The most common human cell in your body is blood cells, which don't have DNA in them at all. They're not really even a cell in the classic sense that the first ones are found. And then they make up 90% of your cells in your body. And then the rough majority of cells, it varies by time of day in your body after that, are not human at all. They are the various gut bacteria that you have inside you of a million different varieties. Those outnumber all your other cells, including your blood cells combined. Right? But you look at your blood cells and those cells, they make about 95% of your cells. So a little about 5% of them is yours. And even then, a lot of those are white cells. That's not very complicated. We are not really the majority of our mass or our quantity count, as it were. And so the idea of having, a million weird viruses, mutant viruses inside you is better than a million different varieties of carefully crafted, warranted, and insured robots. I think I'll take those. At least I have something to sue when it's over, it goes wrong.
Right. And you touched on the data gathering potential in that response. Mm-hmm. And one of the themes, I think, of your predictions is that in some cases you take something that a lot of people only see the downside to, and you offer a more nuanced perspective. Big data is one of those areas. There are a lot of fears around the idea of data profiles being used for evil, and you don't dismiss those concerns with the potential for loss of privacy or totalitarian governments using data to track people, for example, but you also describe the potential of data to do everything from making life more convenient to ending transmissible disease, to ending loneliness by basically improving matchmaking or friend-making algorithms, and ending boredom, helping people to find their ideal career, and the list goes on. So could you walk through the ways that data could potentially improve our lives?
Knowledge is power is obviously the first one that, and we prologue that by saying a lot of times with all the various future problems we have to start by asking if this is truly a new problem or just a new flavor. One thing that's a concern for the near future is the idea of designer babies, children that might be engineered to be better. And so, well, that's interesting, but we've been doing that for centuries. Sometimes we have things that we weren't planning to, we don't really do properly, like medicines that were supposed to make you live long or be, irresistibly seductive. People will hawk on those for centuries. They didn't work. But they've still made the same moral decision. Shooting somebody with a gun where there's no bullet inside is still the decision to kill them, regardless of the fact that it didn't fire off. The same thing, we have technology that actually did work. We've been crossbreeding animals and crops and people for centuries. We already made those decisions. Whether or not they were the right decision and did vary by culture is another matter, but it's not a new problem. Big data is the same thing. You didn't have the same senses of privacy in the 1800s or the 1700s or before that, when, depending on where you lived, you're usually part of a tribe of 100 people, 200 people, local clan, whatever it is, community, village, who've known you your whole life, and they remembered every embarrassing thing you did. Every get-together was like that embarrassing family get-together where someone has to remind you of whatever you used to do that was stupid when you were a teen or a 2-year-old or whatever it is. Humans don't like that, but it's still been part of our existence for a long time. And they didn't tend to have a lot of privacy. We have more now and we want to keep it. So I don't want to, start that off by saying, well, with big data, we just have to go ahead and say, let's go ahead and have this problem because we used to have it in the past so we can suck it up. No, we want to maintain that privacy and get more. We just need to keep that in mind, the context that it's not entirely a new problem. And one of the ways that we would deal with this was actually from my videos a few years back. There was another prediction one. I said, one way we're going to deal with the problem of everybody walking around with cameras on them 24/7 is it won't be about what you're allowed to take an image of, because of course I can take an image of something right now with my eye. No one has the right to edit my memory. And that becoming more accurate or digital, so that I was simply carrying it around with me all the time, so that I record every moment of my life, is not really something that we have a right to tell people they can't do, probably. But what we could do instead is say, when you go to post this, you're not allowed to post pictures of other people without their permission. And that becomes incredibly inconvenient for a lot of people because, well, that guy was just walking by my photo. I didn't know who he was to get his permission. And say, how do we solve that problem? And say, well, big data solves that one too. All that photo tagging, it can pop in there, and instead of saying, would you like to tag this person in your photo, it can say, this person has been blurred. Do you want us to send them a message asking if they would like to see you? They don't even know who the person is. They're walking by, they're blurred in a picture. And they never say, okay. So that picture is blurred forever until they say otherwise. And you have no control over that, but you get your own picture. That might be the way that we move with this. With big data, you have the opportunity for anonymity you would never even imagine, where you would be snipped out of everybody else's photographs, where you could be removed from all these things, where certain protections just become available. Think about how that could be used for abuse victims. That's how big data could help in a case like that. Every mention of them is done by an artificial intelligence that walks through and carefully snips it out. It becomes a great system for redaction. That's the good way that can be used. The bad way, obviously, is the same privacy concerns we already have for this. It's just a reminder that technology is a tool, or it doesn't necessarily lead to an apocalypse. So we have these options for big data in terms of what they can do for privacy, good and ill. But then there's all the other advantages, because outside of privacy, big data is almost universally amazingly good. We have huge files on people these days for their medical history. They're thick like that help us predict what's going to be wrong with them, and a big factor in us telling, making them live longer, because something that would be a normal symptom in other people is a very big symptom of a real illness in another person with more data on them. To say, oh, that's an emerging cancer, that's an emerging side of this same illness your great grandfather had. Imagine if your Fitbit was taking your heart rate all the time for your whole life. If it was taking your respiration, not just your average for the day, but every single beat was recorded. Every little jump was noticed. Every time you slept and for how long was noticed. Security measures can be put on this to keep that genuinely secret, but it's there for your doctor or for the AI that's going to interpret these things. And it's going to say, this person is having this problem breathing. It's going to know you're asthmatic before you do. It's going to know that you've picked up an illness before you show this full sign of a fever. And it's going to know exactly where you did that at. And it's going to know exactly what everybody else was at nearby you then. And you can still deal with that with anonymity. You could even have an opt-in or opt-out system. So suddenly you've caught an illness and it can backtrack and say, these symptoms must have been from something you got infected with 3 to 6 hours ago. Where were you over the course of the last 3 to 6 hours? And it's got your GPS coordinates down to the second. And who else was in a bubble of 10 feet of you during that time? And you can send them a little warning, say, how are you feeling? Or talk their little smartphone and say, are they feeling fine? I got X symptoms. Say, oh, my guy's got those symptoms too. And they can quarantine that area very smartly, very easily, and potentially without ever needing to actually bring anybody in. It just says, you need to come swing by the hospital, please. Or it alerts people that this particular person's got this illness. Where the privacy line there is tricky. But that's one example for a current problem. One way this will probably end up being our last big pandemic. What are other ways it helps? It's the one in school that learns that this particular kid, while he's listening to lessons, always finds references to A, interesting, and B, aggravating. So it just picks a different word, maybe just a little tiny synonym in a lecture, and that changes. And the kid pays more attention. It looks at their eyes, their biosignature, and says they're bored as heck on this topic. So let's switch on to a parallel topic that's less boring to them, or let's just rephrase it. Let's use lesson plan version 7 out of 20 or 30 we actually have on the same topic. Different presenter. It's the thing that knows it well enough to be able to predict that coming in. Where you get these options, more predictive power is always better. And with the big data aspect, when we know more about people, then we can predict better for them. And then the thing is just how do we make this a tool they get to control, and how do we get to make it so people can't use it as a tool to oppress, to take over, or to dehumanize people. Those are not trivial challenges, but they're all options.
Absolutely. And you describe that challenge with data as being, how do we keep privacy and prevent these other abuses while also keeping all of these wonderful potential advantages? And that's kind of a theme throughout the video, where a lot of people only see the negatives of a new technology. You look at both the pros and the cons and point out that we need to be really careful to avoid excessive restrictions, like with virtual reality technology. You certainly don't dismiss the challenges of potential addiction and so forth to very realistic virtual reality, but you also warn people not to paint all of VR technology with a broad brush. So what are some potential upsides of improving virtual reality technology?
I suppose we're still on the addiction thing, is it's not really a new one. A lot of us who are in my age range or a little bit older have the old Nintendo thumb from using the controller all the time with that, or we know the Konami code to this day, or we got exhausted playing Space Invaders, dumping quarters in the machine for that, or Pong. Pong apparently is a game interesting to monkeys as well, as when all current brain augmentation subjects basically plays Pong mentally with a chip in its head while eating banana smoothies. Big invention. So, what are the advantages of virtual reality? And again, that addiction thing is a real issue, because we can joke about the simpler technologies being just as addictive, but they probably are not. They probably are not as addictive. We have a lot more people addicted to video games than when I was a kid, I think. Is it going to be that way lives in a virtual reality? Well, first, we probably want to talk about a little about what exactly is reality, because in a lot of religions and a lot of theologies, this is one layer of reality anyway. Right? There's a higher level you're supposed to be attaining that you're not supposed to live in. The idea of the mundane versus, or profane world versus the sacred world element, that everything above us is just a dream. And the same thing with simulation hypothesis too, that there's, a higher level of reality. And this comes in with virtual reality. Like I say, well, I'm living in this, this other simulated world beneath me. You can just keep going down layer after layer of simulations. Say, where is the reality on that? I think of this as a real world, but we could be in a simulation. I don't think that would make us less real. And say, people say you live in a fake world. You hear this about folks who are in various professions that insulate them a lot. You live in kind of a fake reality, an insulated world of some sort. When you get out into the real world, things will be different. And that's usually not to imply that those are actually fake in the sense of not existing, but it is worth noting that we build artificial environments for ourselves a lot. That's a lot of human nature. I don't think my house is a fake world, even though it is obviously very manufactured compared to the 2 feet of snow outside that there currently is the naturescape. So we want to be a little bit careful on what we are actually qualifying as downsides of virtual reality. In of itself, someone spending their entire life living in a virtual world sounds horrifying. But why? They might be working from home, might be the same as just working from home. They might be living in the Matrix, busy doing science, while talking to other people who lived in the Matrix, entirely aware of the world above them, though not wanting to focus on too much, getting real work done, and interacting with people who do not live in that particular place too, just like if they live in an individual town. The future of virtual reality might be a lot of individual shared towns or servers that people spend most or even all their time on. And again, that does sound a little bit horrifying, but we probably want to not just assume that is the case. A lot of times we have a knee-jerk reaction to things that's maybe not fail. These things might be a little more than the equivalent of the new colonized settlement out on the west side of the country that is far away from everyone else. Difference being they can actually just contact you up instantly or unplug or have you come join them there. So I would not be surprised if there actually were a lot of, almost to the point of being virtual nations. And that is something we looked at more in our virtual wars episode years back. Those are more the long-term things, but I like to point those out as reasons why we don't want to just assume certain aspects of this are bad. Because you start by telling people could live their whole life in virtual reality. That's horrible. We should outlaw that. And the answer from all of us is essentially, oh, yeah, absolutely. And I don't think it really would be healthy in most people's cases. But at the same time, maybe we don't want to just assume it always will be bad. How do we deal with it in the short term? What are the benefits of virtual reality? How does a kid learn history? I said, well, somebody gives them a boring lecture. No, that's how they don't learn history. The way they learn history is to immerse themselves in it. Whether it's a good book, whether it's an amazing lecturer. I had a great history teacher when I was in college. Man was like a legend locally. And, maybe it's a movie. Maybe it's I hate to say it, a fantasized movie version of the past, as we have to see a lot of the period dramas. Those are great. You like Downton Abbey or the Tudors or Versailles, whatever it is, but they're not all that historically accurate. But if they sucked you into it, if they made you love that period of history, you're going to know everything there is about that. And we almost all have a period or two of history that we are just in love with. Right? And whether that is entirely accurate view of history can vary, but hey, that's the nature of getting interested in history. Often we have rose-colored glasses about periods, but at the same time, that's how a student learns to love history. And so if you get to actually go hang out with Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, if you get to actually go meet James Madison or go meet the folks who signed the Magna Carta, or if you get to go see, Augustus or Julius Caesar back in their time, even if it's obviously got to have a lot of plugged in bits to make that seem more realistic, that's an option that kids might have growing up learning these things. And getting to actually not, live those experiences, probably not entirely realistically, but to be immersed in them like that, that would be something that they're going to love, right? How is it to learn chemistry if you actually go get to work in a lab in a virtual environment from day one with the world's best chemistry teacher? Because the simulation is that good that you're always getting, the 20 best lecturers on a given topic have prepared a lecture on this topic or a virtual thing for this environmental topic, and that's what you have to go learn. And maybe you have a teacher back here that helps you out with something specifics, but that's the virtual learning edge. It is the one that lets you make sure that people love every moment of the learning experience. And entertainment obviously is a no-brainer. We were just talking about how that could be used for education, but virtual reality changes a lot of that too. But other aspects are huge too. Imagine if you have a robot that is, we'll call it an actual proper telerobotic experience where you could use a simulated hand to reach through with your hand and touch things. You got one of those in every house, and when you have any problems, you call in a repairman who just pops in virtually and repairs the thing on the spot. No travel time, no trying to have you describe the problem. They just go, oh, there it is. And there'll be something like Uber, but for carpenters or plumbers. You pop in, I got a problem, and somebody from halfway around the world who happens to be free at that time takes the case, goes in, looks at it, and says, here's your problem, and fix it on the spot, or orders something out to be delivered by drone. It's cool to say, hey, you could do a virtual surgery on someone, so the best surgeon in the world for that type of surgery can plug into anywhere, anytime, and control the robot. And this is true. You say we could use this to let people walk around on the moon individually and build stuff. And this is true. And these are cool applications, but they are nothing like the day-to-day applications of, that we be having all day long. That cool technology that you're going to use once a year or once in a lifetime versus that smartphone appeal, that TV appeal, that thing you get to use all day long. How does this improve my life? How do we let people learn to drive better? Learn so many new hobbies better. And not to say you're going to replace your vacation to a mountain or climbing a mountain with virtual reality, but it means we can have you climb one virtually the first 20 or 30 times that you're already an expert when you go to head up to do the real one. You've already learned your lessons, fallen down the gorge, know all the tricks, and know to be cautious. And now you can go do the real thing and enjoy it. These are the options available to us with virtual reality.
Changing topics a bit, you discuss aging workforces and falling fertility rates, a long-term trend that humanity is dealing with. And you point out how technology could potentially help mitigate some of the negative effects by helping people who want children but are unable to have children to have them, and also how technology might be able to help us maintain a high standard of living even with a smaller population by having robots or machines replace some roles in the economy. But one of your predictions is also that the population will be over 10 billion without sacrificing quality of life. So I know that's a lot of different things, but could you talk a bit about that? Population.
Population. I always think of the situation when you go to Walmart and say, what's cool about Walmart is you can go there at 3 o'clock in the morning, pre-pandemic, and you had a choice of 200 types of cereal up there that you could pick from, and 50 types of pet food. And your pet is going to reject each one of those in order, and you are going to pick the same brand as normal because decisions take a lot of energy. They're one of the most exhausting and stressful things you can do, but still could have that option, and every so often you'll try a new cereal. This is, to me, always the upside of being able to do more variety. I would take this to the analogy of, let's say I'm a country that has declining population right now. You have basically three options. You can slowly choke away, you can convince people to have more kids, you can bring in immigration. And a lot of times all those cause tensions of some kind. They have their ups and their downs. Robots are the same way. You can bring in a more automated workforce to handle some of your problems. We only look to add more options with technology. The answer is almost never, this is the technology that will do everything. We want diversity of technology too. Give me 1,000 options, I'll pick which. Although then please give me a robo-advisor so I can acquire a brand affiliation after he makes a suggestion too. With population, people in the 70s, there was always this book called The Population Bomb, and it predicted 16 billion people. In the early 80s, when I'd heard that, I thought, isn't that a good thing? Everybody else said there was a whole wars we needed a war. I didn't quite get at the time. I said, isn't that a good thing? Oh, more people good. And of course, later folks explained, well, of course it's not good because they'd all be eating each other. And I remember me thinking to myself, well, doesn't take a lot more time to grow someone than to eat them. That doesn't seem like a good strategy. But it got me thinking about that entire topic. And it, was like, why do we have more people now than 1,000 years ago when we got better at farming? Can we grow more food than we need for 10 billion people? Oh, yeah. There was a point where we probably can't support more people through anything approaching traditional agriculture on this planet. However, we do not need even one more square foot of farming area than we already have in use, and indeed probably about half of what we do, to support about twice the population we have now. So the idea that we need to be anything less than 10 billion, it's a nice round number, but folks say 9 is going to be the top and it'll be very problematic. I don't see it at all. I don't see that as the least bit of a problem. And I would say that even the idea of 16 billion from the population bomb, not a problem. You should be able to go above that too, but you do actually still have to put some additional work in or need some really big new technologies, but it's doable. What's the advantage of having 10 billion people? Well, whether you got 1 billion people or 10 billion people or 100 billion people, it always depends on how do you look at people. If you see people as a nuisance who are going to cause you problems, then more of them is bad. If you see them as people who tend to get jobs done and have fun lives and work and solve problems, then more people is going to usually be good. And those are blanket comments, obviously. Those maximums you can't really exceed. But say a lot of times with population growth, it always comes down to whether or not people think it's a good thing or a bad thing. And somewhere around the turn of the century or in the years that followed, I started hearing about how all the Western countries had declining population rates. And they said, oh, the more money you have, the more likely you are not to have kids. And I thought that was strange because most of the folks I think off the top of my head who had a lot of money had a lot of kids. And I said, isn't it more likely that people would start marrying later because they got a profession and marry other professionals just to have fewer kids? And then I said, you know what I'll do? I'll look up the 10 countries that have the highest GDP and the 10 countries that have the lowest birth rate and see if there's a lot of matches. And the year I did that, there was not a single one. The year after that, I checked it again, there was one match. The year after that, none again. Right? less than random, less than if it was random. So I couldn't see the correlation when we talked about it. It seemed to be more like those places that are well developed are probably already pretty populated and would then have most of the actual characteristics of society that doesn't want to have a lot more people. Um, and so we see that kind of that Malthusian mindset getting into those places. We say we shouldn't have any more people. Well, technology helps with that. Technology avoids accidental births where we don't want them. Technology allows us to have lifestyles that don't begin as a 15-year-old farmer getting married and having kids right from that point. And so that can cause a lowering in population. Better technology for getting pregnant when you want to, which we usually say is the goal, to have a family when you feel you're ready and want to. But the problem is right now, as that becomes more and more of a reality, for a lot of us, it's to start later. I'm 41 and I have no kids. My wife is 33. We feel like we should be getting started, and we probably wish we'd start a little bit earlier. Wouldn't it be nice, though, if you could start whenever you want to and have families for as long as you wanted to? And so the last century was technology is mostly designed to limit the number of kids being born by accident, while at the same time basically eliminating child mortality. That's almost gone. Big progress. Century ahead will be ways that we have technology that makes it easy to start a family later when you want to, as you want to. And I don't see how that could not avoid having more people as a result of it. So whether we want or not, I think we probably expect to see more people in the next century. And the big one is I can't think of any reason why, so long as we comfortably can support them, that would not be a good thing.
And related to that, you predict that access to food, medicine, and information will be vastly wider than now, 100 years in the future. And it's certainly true that that has been the broad historical trend up until this point in time, as followers of humanprogress.org are well aware. But of course, it is possible that whatever policies or institutions or technologies have allowed us to achieve that progress could be abandoned, or some disaster could strike and disrupt all these positive trends. Progress is obviously not inevitable. So why do you think the positive trends of people having greater access to food, medicine, and information will continue?
Well, a lot of it's from that greater access to information right from the get-go. Think about the feedback loops on these things. Now, we know the stock market has risen most years in a generally upward direction for a century or whatever it is now. And that's not just because it magically does this, but it's a pretty reliable trend. Can we be sure the stock market will continue to rise? Well, tomorrow an asteroid could land on Wall Street. I almost can promise you it's going to be a while for the markets to get back in order if that happens. Not really a predictable event. So we don't talk about inevitability, right? Inevitability is for the laws of thermodynamics, and maybe not even them. Everything else is mutable. However, so many things have feedback. What happens when I have more food? Well, I have more people, and more of them can go into specialists, more geniuses. I get more Einsteins. And they're not that rare, right? Folks like Newton or Einstein with that level of IQ, they are millions of them alive right now, right? This is not one of those things that only ever pops up once per generation. The local luck of having them in that field, interested in that field, and pursuing that field, and getting a couple of those discoveries, maybe a little bit more so. But these are not freak luck people. There are a lot of Da Vinci level people out there as well. Add to that, well, now you got them living a little bit longer. A lot of people do have the kind of peak in terms of their research ability, for instance, in their early 20s, but a lot don't. A lot of professors are still kicking out brand new and their best material way after that. And we don't know why people really tend to do that more in their 20s or 30s, though. There is that young production level. But maybe that has to do with extending people's lives to make that longer too. Whatever the case happens to be, more researchers, more work getting done. The longer people live individually, the more productive they will each individually be in that lifetime. What would you be like if you enjoyed great 20-something health when you're 200? Well, there's a chance that you might be like a person who sits on the beach all day long and does nothing. There's that chance, right? On the other hand, there's also a chance that that's what you do for your vacations because you are a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer. You can build a house from scratch on your own, and you have hiked up 20 mountains, kayak down 30,000 rivers, whatever it is. What kind of person are you like when you've enjoyed the level of prosperity that the culture has these days, and you got to do it for a couple of centuries, and when you had to spend half your life either growing up or being a senior or taking care of your own relatively small number of kids? These are feedback things. If they're happening, what happens when I have a longer life? Society gets more prosperous. What happens when society gets more prosperous? people live longer and there's more of us, right? We have more time to devote to specializations and to other things. It's not really for us to decide how people spend their personal time, but I tend to think most people will do that in something that we think of as semi-productive. Not across the board, nor necessarily should be, but societies with more spare time are likely to be productive in areas of art and science and other, theology or philosophy or any number of other good pursuits people might have as a way of expanding us beyond just, enjoying time in their garden or whatever it is. That is what we get. We get feedback loops, positive feedback, more automation, more free time, more production per individual. How do we deal with the fact that people don't have a job in that area? Well, I would say that while I understand people always being concerned about what will happen when robots take everyone's jobs, they've been taking people's jobs for over a century now, and we still, at the moment at least, have help wanted signs all over the place. All over the place. We have no shortage of places we're looking to hire for all sorts of jobs. That may change one day, but they say if you have the blessed with that much prosperity that your biggest problem is trying to find something for people to do, then hopefully the first thing you can tell them is, I know you're bored, find some way to cure boredom. And they might, So, but that is definitely a problem for the future. And it's okay to have problems for the future. We don't have to solve them all today. I don't know how you deal with people who all grow up with, basically a spoiled brats, having so much prosperity, but I think you can probably figure out a way to solve that. And I think that a lot of times I've seen people who've grown up very, fortunate in their circumstances, arguably everybody in the modern 20th century Western or 21st century Western world is, and they're all very noble, very wise, very productive, or very self-sacrificing individuals. So I don't think we should be assuming that better prosperity is going to ruin civilization. It might be a challenge, though. Again, we don't worry about challenges for the future not existing. They will be there. There will be plenty of things to keep us preoccupied.
Absolutely. And of course, technology has created a lot of jobs too. And many of those jobs are a lot more pleasant than the jobs that technology replaced. And
I always put a caveat on that, though, because apparently we have a higher stress level than a lot of previous civilizations did. And I do wonder how they get that data sometimes, but I think they make a lot less back-breaking labor than they used to. But I'm not entirely certain that all of our jobs are necessarily all the more pleasant across the board. Probably, but there does seem to be a certain greater stress that comes to living nowadays. It may not be, it may just be, you're exposed to the entire world and all its problems, and bad news has more longevity than good news. But there are always downsides living in an advanced civilization, so to speak, technologically. We apparently do have additional stress that previous generations haven't had, which is kind of ironic because we have such a better life overall. But that's another thing that we could potentially be working to solve,
That's true. That negative news cycle, that's a good point. I think a lot of people don't realize that their lives are easier in a lot of ways than their ancestors. But I want to move on to some of your other predictions as well. So 2 of your predictions are about space exploration and how far we will be advanced in that area a century from now. And I know that this is something you could talk about all day, but just succinctly, could you tell us a little bit more about what your predictions are for space exploration over the next century?
I would guess by the year 2121, we will probably have at least one solid moon base that's on par with the equivalent that we think of Mikimoto from Antarctica, excuse me, and probably some base on Mars called Musk that's fairly similar because we've seen this obsession with Mars. I would guess we'd have some asteroid mining, probably for precious metals and for raw materials to work on in space, and probably mining on the moon, which also has lots of raw materials. That's probably where I'd put it. I would think we'd have an automated probe on every place that we thought was interesting. I would think space probes by even 30 years from now should be the sort of thing that sending them out really doesn't require much more technology than we associate to a relatively expensive drone and probably a fairly similar price tag. So we'll have drones all over the solar system by then.
Energy abundance is another one of your predictions. Could you flesh that one out a little bit?
Oh yeah, that's that. I would always add that one as a prediction / wishful thinking, hopefully, too, because we need it. That is in many ways the one we absolutely do need is energy abundance. Regardless of what one's stance on the ecological issues, there is a finite supply of oil, and the sun produces insane amounts of power. So in the long term, all methods for wanting to get power, either nuclear, which is how the sun gets it, be it fission or fusion, and solar directly, because that's how the sun provides it. The other power options can be useful, and only, they say, what should you research? All of them, because one nice thing is if you can run your car on things other than gasoline, you're not subject to OPEC switching around the prices every week on you. This brings more stability when you got options. Both the natural problems as well. If you have something that knocks out tankers, that's going to lower prices too. If you got cloudy weather because a volcano erupted, your solar power is not doing as well that year. It's nice to not have scarcity. And that's the big one is energy abundance is a necessity because economies act differently based on what the scarce thing is, as well as they act differently when they're in a period of overall scarcity. And it's not always in bad ways. You have to get some very interesting innovation going off them. The pandemic has done this a lot for innovation. I think most of us would just afford to have done it the slower way to get that innovation, though. And so, should you take advantage of hydropower? Yes. Wind power? Yes. Solar power? Yes. Passive solar power? Yes. Geothermal? Yes. Fission? Yes. Fusion, if we can get it working. Solar power? Yes. Space-based solar power? Yes, please. And the answer to all those is which one is best is, even in some cases where one might cost a little bit more than the other, it's probably a good idea to keep running it because economy of scale will help those get better with time, but also because, a diversity of diet for these things is healthy because then you have less weaknesses exposed to it. If you go only on potatoes, then you're in deep trouble if there's a potato famine. And it doesn't matter that potatoes cost 90% of what wheat did, per se. It's good to still have some wheat production.
And you touched on this, but many people are very anxious about what the next century holds for the environment. And you share some thoughts on the potential of technology to mitigate climate change and preserve different species. You make some really interesting points about preserving different species' DNA and biodiversity as a sort of contingency plan, making backups of DNA. And your ninth prediction is that we might actually be able to even reintroduce extinct species, like Jurassic Park. Could you tell me a little bit about your thinking on those things?
I'd say when it comes to bringing back dinosaurs, Jurassic Park style, that's a little bit like we were talking with the virtual reality of trying to go and see the times with Caesar or Augustus or Genghis Khan. You don't have really good records there, so you're going to have to do some guesswork. But if we know what they look like from their bones and all the predictions, we can probably fidget the DNA because a lot of it still can be fragmented around on organisms. Remember, DNA is just patterns. It's just data, right? And if I don't actually have a blueprint for a Ford Mustang lying around, but I have a bunch of pictures of them and descriptions, I can make something that is basically a Ford Mustang, at least as well as we know it is, because we're doing it too as good as we knew it to be. But things like mammoths, we get DNA from them, the dodo bird DNA. And I do not ever want to imply that you should give up on other conservation efforts in favor of just taking DNA samples from everything, because that's kind of alluding to defeat, right? But I will sometimes have folks say, don't suggest that we should take DNA samples from all these things and put them in archives or digitize that DNA instead of just freezing it too, because then people will stop trying to save the Siberian tiger. I said, well, I hope not. I don't think that's true. However, I would really rather put that airbag in that car, even if it meant people drove a little bit riskier, because contingency plans are good. And we can conserve all we want, but if an asteroid comes and lands on Madagascar, that's gone. That place is a trove of DNA. There's amazing things that are just not even on other islands that are they on Madagascar. What would it take to wipe that out? Well, human stupidity, certainly, but accident, volcano will be there for all we know. Just some naturally occurring virus that just decimates one of the main pieces of the agriculture there, or whatever it is, ruins the area. So you do your contingency plans, you take all that DNA samples. And the nice thing is you don't even need a whole big ton of them to be divorced, because if you actually know what the various bits of DNA do, then you can take one single strand from species and put your genetic diversity into it just by wiggling a few things around, or if you see it's got some genetic deficiency, you paste it in from someplace else. Say, well, you can make squid people by taking some squid DNA and putting on a monkey or a person. So you're not putting squid DNA on somebody. You're taking a trait they've got and putting it on there. It's like saying I made a house car hybrid because I used the fan system from a car inside the house. So
Right.
There's a lot we can do with preserving the environment, and that we absolutely should be doing. But at the same time, we shouldn't we should definitely take those contingency steps, because contingencies often are needed.
You also say toward the end of the video, the last 100 years brought a lot of pleasant surprises, and with some hard work and determination, the next century probably will too. So on that note, what is something positive where you would be surprised if it happened. It's not a prediction, but it's also not outside the realm of possibility in the next century.
Oh. So usually the first part in my head would be either a friendly aliens landing or a perpetual motion machine. I don't really expect either of those to happen, but or something like the ability to travel to multiverses that were parallel copies of Earth that were uninhabited. Those would be my technologies I wouldn't expect to happen, but which, if we're going to discover them, probably would be sooner than later, and would just be mind-blowingly cool to live through. So
They would be cool. You say you think we will survive and even thrive over the next 100 years. So this is my last question. What, in a nutshell, gives you the hope to say that?
well, I mean, to say that is this solid conviction that if I turn out to be wrong, there won't be anyone around to point it out to other people. So, if you are an optimist by your predictions in nature, generally speaking, people will be around to remember that you were and give you credit. Now, you look at the past, right? We cannot see the future. No one should ever take any prediction I say and say that it's right anymore. They should believe the weather forecast for next year. Right? We look at general trends. I can tell you it's probably going to rain next year. It's not a guarantee, but there's a reason why I believe that. And it's not just because it happening. We look at a lot of times in the past and say, well, this happened a lot and this must happen in the future. No, that's a good basis to assume it will, but there's a reason why the sun rises tomorrow. And if you know why it does, it makes it a lot easier to know why it's going to keep doing it and be confident of that. We have grown as a civilization in the last century or two because we've absorbed the idea that people are a valuable resource when you treat them right and when you encourage them to do the same. And when you tell them to expand themselves and learn and try to be productive mentally and in other ways. If you're betting on that, and I think that's an optimistic view of humanity, if you bet on that and it was up for you, that's what you're going to get. You're going to get a civilization that just keeps winning. It's going to just keep winning. And I think like we've seen that for the last 2 centuries. And if we stick to that, that's what should keep happening. We can veer a little bit here and there, but it seems like everyone still seems to feel that way, that the expansion of knowledge, that we should be looking into valuing the individual, that we should be looking at exploring new horizons. While we believe that those are important, that is what we will do. And if we're doing those, odds are pretty good. We are going to continue to do well, so long as we don't open some genuine Pandora's box and find out, oh, hey, oops, we blew up the planet by this new power source. Things can happen through bad luck, incompetence, so many other things too. But I would say that the odds look very good for us based on what we can say.
And toward the end of the video, you also say, with some grit and determination, we can solve our problems rather than fall prey to some inevitable doom. And I really like that line. I could not agree more. So on that note, check out Isaac's video if you haven't, and the many other videos on his channel. Isaac, thank you so much for talking to me. This has been a delight.
Thank you, Chelsea, for having me on.